All right, we're going to be continuing our Bible in a Year plan that's put forward by the Charles Stanley Life Principles Daily Bible. And today we're going to be reading the story of the parting of the Red Sea, very classic story there. And then in the New Testament, we have the triumphal entry. And there's actually some correlation between some of the events we've read about recently and some of the events we'll be reading about today. So we've just read that the 10th plague happened in Egypt, the dying of the firstborn of every Egyptian, from the Pharaoh down to the slave to the livestock. So then they told the Hebrews, they said, just get out of here before we're all dead. On their way out, the Hebrews get lots of gold and riches from the Egyptians. And then we start this section where they're talking about how they're going to give praise to the Lord, worship the Lord, remember what he has done for them. But they're still kind of on the run from the Egyptians. And God is guiding them, interestingly, with pillars of cloud and fire. So it says, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. So God doesn't bring them out of Egypt and then say, good luck. He's actually guiding them every step of the way with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, which I imagine is pretty cool to see. Then he kind of sets a trap for the Egyptians. It's interesting. It says he encamps them by the Red Sea. And then he says, for Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. Think of his host as his army. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. So if the Egyptians didn't know that he's the Lord after the 10 plagues that they just endured, God is saying, all right, they still don't know, so we're going to have to prove it to them again. So at this point, Pharaoh's got quite an army with him. It says he has his chariot, he took his army with him, 600 chosen chariots, and all other chariots of Egypt with officers all over them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen, and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea. Now, at this point, you might think, okay, well, the Lord has done these 10 plagues. He's shown many times how he separates the Egyptians from the Hebrews or the Israelites. I still don't know if I'm supposed to use those terms interchangeably. But at this point, you might think, okay, Pharaoh's got his army. It's probably the most powerful army in the world, even with all the plagues that they just went through. However, the Israelites just saw the power of God 10 different times. And they saw what he can do and the power that he has. So you'd think, okay, they probably have some faith in their God that he's going to deliver them once again. But just like us, we have pretty short-term memory of what God can bring us through. And when the next battle comes up and the enemy is right in front of us again, we forget everything that God has brought us through, and we end up fearing. And that's exactly what the Israelites do. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. So this goes back to where they were at the very beginning, where Moses tells the Pharaoh to let the people go, and the Pharaoh actually responds, not by letting them go, obviously, because the Lord hardens his heart, but he makes things worse for the Israelites. He says, you're only asking to go worship your God because you're idle. You're not working hard enough. So I'm going to make you work harder. I'm going to say that you get no straw from us. You have to go find your own straw somehow. But we're going to demand that you make the same number of bricks. So this stresses them out. They're working themselves probably into the grave, just trying to put up with this brick order without the usual straw that they have to make it. And they complain to Moses. They complain. They don't even want to hear from God. And they say, why did you tell the Pharaoh to let us go? Even though they were the ones who cried out in the first place to the Lord, saying, I believe it was probably when the Pharaoh was trying to kill all their firstborns. And they cried out to God saying, deliver us. But then they second guess the way God goes about it. And the second things start to go hard for them, they doubt God. They throw up their hands. They say, this isn't working. Things are just getting worse. Stop helping because you're not helping. And once again, even after the 10 plagues, and God has clearly shown that he wants to make his promise, he wants to fulfill the promise that he's made with his people. And the power that he's displayed is just ridiculous at this point. They still fear in this moment, and to the point of losing all hope, it seems. They say, you just brought us out of Egypt so we could die in the wilderness. Why did you even get us involved in this in the first place? We could have still just been slaves. So completely losing all gratitude to God for delivering them out of slavery and forgetting everything that he's brought them through already. Now, Moses shows that he is developed as a character, because in that first one, when the people grumble, it seems like Moses kind of turns to God and he's like, why is this happening? But in this one, he actually seems to show his strength, his strengthening, and his progress and his development as a leader. And God has been developing him throughout all the plagues. He was involving Moses in a lot of the different plagues that were happening. So when they say it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. What a pump up speech right there. Just fear not, stand firm, use and see the salvation of the Lord. He will work for you today. I could just read the whole verse again because it's so good. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Maybe that's a good thing for us to remember. When we lose hope, when we fear, when it seems like the enemy is attacking us and we're not going to be able to succeed, perhaps part of us is correct in knowing that if it is up to us, we're not going to be able to defeat that enemy, whatever it is. But we shouldn't fear. We shouldn't lose faith, because the Lord will work for us. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. And it almost seems like it's better if we are silent. If we're trying to fight on our own, we're trying to fight in our own strength. And if there's anything that we're not supposed to do, it's to have self-reliance and to try to do things through our own control, our own discipline, our own willpower. We are called to try to have discipline and willpower, but there's a difference in having God's strength come through you for that discipline and trying to do it all on your own. So I like how Moses says, the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. So in those moments where we feel like we're up against something difficult, maybe it's temptation, maybe it's sin, that's where if we try to fight it, it actually makes it more likely that we're going to fall into that sin, because we're fighting it not in the way that we're supposed to. So then it's actually, I wouldn't say it's better just to sin and get it over with, but we're also not doing the right thing when we're trying to fight that sin on our own. So what you need to understand is that the Lord will fight for you. You just have to be silent. It's in that moment you just have to surrender to God, not surrender to the sin. Sometimes easier said than done. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." So he once again involves Moses in this. He says, "Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it." So, the Lord could just do this all on his own, but once again, he's involving Moses in this, developing him into the leader. And then we know the rest. The sea parts. And I see another one that's pretty interesting. "And then morning, watched the Lord in the pillar of fire and of cloud, looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, 'Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians.'" So the Egyptians maybe have more faith in God's power than the Israelites do at this point. They're saying, "Oh, the Lord's on their side. Watch out." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horses." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. And then the people of Israel just walk out unscathed. So thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Wow. So what a turnaround. They go from saying, "You just brought us into the wilderness to die because there weren't enough graves in Egypt." So dramatic. Although there is a army bearing down on them at that point, to the point where God delivers them. He wipes out the Egyptians with his great power. And then the people feared the Lord. They believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So what's a takeaway we can have here? Perhaps it's that when there's a battle in front of us, let's say it's a battle with temptation, and we have fear because it seems like the enemy is more powerful than us, we are actually correct in thinking that the enemy is more powerful than us. We're not going to outsmart the devil if he's trying to tempt us. He knows exactly how to do it. But in that moment, we should not fear. We should trust in the Lord and know that he is going to fight for us. All that we have to do is be silent. And then we can see how the Lord fights for us. And it's perhaps through this fear that our faith grows stronger, that we learn to fear the Lord more, that we believe in the Lord more. And perhaps that's why God has us go through struggles, because when we go about things correctly and he delivers us through them, we see the power of the Lord and it makes us have more faith in him. However, if we try to fight it all on our own, we end up failing. It actually reminds me a little bit of the scary movies called Smile, and then the second one, Smile 2, where when I first watched them, I thought, those are the most messed up movies I've ever seen. What a terrible message. Where I'm not going to get into all the details, but it's basically people realize that pretty much a curse is upon them and they're going to die very soon. And they're trying everything to figure out this curse. How did they get out of it and all this stuff? And the movie ends with them dying. And I thought, what a terrible message. And then I thought, you know what? You could view it in a weird way as a Christian message, because in both of these movies, they don't turn to God. They try to do it all on their own. And the movie is basically showing that it's futile. If you're trying to fight evil on your own, you will lose. So, Smile, hot take, but I would say it's actually a Christian movie. I don't think anyone has probably ever said that before if you know the entire plot. But I think the message is correct. If you're trying to fight on your own, you're not going to win. You're going to lose. If you give the fight to God, he will fight for you, he'll deliver you, and then you'll believe in him more. But as I said, it's easier said than done. Occasionally we're going to fail as Christians. It's a good thing that Jesus died for us so that when we repent for our sins, God accepts us back. And we have to be willing to accept that grace, because part of us could want to beat up on ourselves even more after sin, thinking that that's going to make us righteous with God, to show how mad we are at the sin that we committed. But part of that might be us trying to think if we try hard enough, we can win back favor from God. But it's nothing that we do that gets us back in good graces with God. It's what Jesus did that makes us righteous with God. Nothing that we have done. Now, there's just some thoughts for you for today. Now let's get into the psalm. I think I remember the psalm being a good one today. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent out his arrows and scattered the foe, lightnings in abundance, and he vanquished them. Wow, it ties in really well with what we're reading in the Old Testament. The story of him basically conquering the Egyptians. I don't know if conquering is the right word. Wiping out their whole army. Then the channels of the sea were seen. The foundations of the world were uncovered. At your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. Interesting. The channels of the sea were seen. I wonder if that's actually pointing back to the Red Sea as well. He sent from above. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me. Okay, this has got to be talking about what we just read. Interesting that these two sections matched up. For they were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He also brought me out into a broad place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. So, once again, when the enemy is in front of you, turn back to God. He is who will deliver you from that strong enemy who's too strong for you. But the Lord is your support, and he'll deliver you because he delights in you. It's good to remember that. And this is why we soak ourselves in scripture and read things like this, so that when you go through some sort of temptation, some sort of enemy trying to attack you who you know is stronger than you, you can come back to scripture like this, where it's a promise. God is saying, I will get you through these things if you rely on me, if you trust in me, if you're just silent as I fight for you. And then Proverbs 6 through 11. Proverb yesterday didn't make much sense to me, so we'll see if this one makes more. It says, go to the ant, you sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall your poverty come on you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. Nope, didn't really get it. It's talking about, I think, ants. And then he's saying, how long will you slumber? So maybe it's calling us to do some work. Perhaps. That's my guess, but I didn't really research that one. So take that with a grain of salt. Then we get into Matthew 21, 1 through 22. And this is the triumphal entry. And, I actually had a very different reading of this time around than the last time I read it. Mostly because I read it alongside the R.C. Sproul commentary. And yeah, I have a different interpretation of it than the last time I read it. So this is Matthew 21, verse 1. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, and I wonder if this Mount of Olives is the same as the Garden of Gethsemane, because I believe that's on the Mount of Olives as well. When they get there, Jesus basically says, go, through his divine knowledge, he says, go, there's a colt and I believe a donkey. Yeah, we'll find a donkey and a colt tied up, go get them, say it's for the Lord. And this is to fulfill the prophecy that says, say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. So this might seem like a small detail. Oh, Jesus is riding in on a donkey. And yeah, okay. But it actually is a key detail for why I'm reading this one differently than before. I'll just continue though, and then we'll do some interpretation. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. So the them doesn't mean he's sitting on the colt and the donkey. The them, plural, is talking about the coats that he's sitting on. I believe he's only sitting on the colt, and they brought them on with it. One, it shows that it's such a young colt that it's never been ridden before, and they know there's going to be a lot of crowds out there, so it's probably good to have that mama donkey next to the colt so it doesn't freak out too much, especially if it's never been ridden before. If you've ever ridden a horse, you know the first time it's ridden, it probably doesn't like it very much. And yeah, I don't think we need to dive into that too much. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, who is this? And the crowd said, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. So, first reading, you think triumphal entry. This is it. This is what the whole ministry has been leading up to. He's going into Jerusalem. This is like the climax of the story, and the people are cheering. It seems that everyone is praising Hosanna to the Son of David. Hosanna means basically save us, or like it's a calling to be saved. And they're saying the Son of David, which shows that they are calling Jesus the fulfillment of the prophecy. They're calling him the Messiah. So crowds lined up, putting their coats, putting palm trees down as Jesus is riding in on this donkey. And you think that that's all just good. It's a triumphal entry. People are welcoming Jesus. But the first time I read this, and I'm not positive I'm interpreting this right, but first time I read this, it seems like it's all good. But now when I read this, it actually kind of makes me sad, to be honest, where I don't think the people know actually what they're cheering for. It says, Hosanna to the Son of David. So it sounds like the Messiah is going to save us. Sounds like they get the picture. However, what they're thinking Jesus is going to do and who Jesus is isn't actually what Jesus is going to do or what kind of salvation he's going to bring. Notice that they call him a prophet, the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. It's interesting that that detail's in there. Perhaps it's in there to show that at this point they don't know that he is the Son of God. And we could maybe even just put that aside for a moment and just understand that they're still mostly expecting saving from the Romans. I could have said that about a minute and a half ago, but I drew out that point for a reason I don't know. They don't know what Jesus is there to do. They think he is there to deliver them from the Romans, and that's why they're cheering. But Jesus perhaps was really thinking about the importance of fulfilling the mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden, with that humble entry, showing that he is not coming in on a war horse to declare war against the Romans. He is coming in as a humble servant, ready to sacrifice himself so that he can save the people not from the Romans, but from sin and death. And that's why this makes me almost sad now, is because before I think everyone's cheering for Jesus, everyone's getting on board, but they don't know what they're cheering for, and they're cheering for the wrong thing. And I imagine Jesus knew this, and it was probably mixed emotions where he's seeing this excitement where everyone is on board for the Messiah coming in, but he just realizes they have no idea what I'm actually here to do. And he's been trying as hard as he could to tell people what he is here to do, but it doesn't seem like people are getting it. And that's why a number of times throughout his ministry, it seems like when he's healing people, when he's multiplying bread, oftentimes he'll pull back and he'll try to go off alone. And it's because he feels this momentum building up that they're going to call him king and then charge out and have an insurrection against the Romans. And a lot of his parables that he tells, and especially what he speaks to the disciples as well, is saying, that's not what I'm here to do. We read one of the parables the other day that I've been thinking about a lot. The one where he says, we can just go back and read it. We literally just read it. It's the mother's request, where James and John's mom asks them to sit right and left on Jesus's throne when he goes into his kingdom. And then the other 10 disciples get mad. And it just shows that they're all looking for positions of power within Jesus's kingdom. And he says, "It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Right here, it's almost the end of his ministry. He's been teaching his disciples this entire time. And right as they're about to be going into Jerusalem, they are still showing that they don't get what he's saying. They're still thinking of positions of power in a very worldly sense, like the kings of the Gentiles who lord that power over their servants. And the great ones exercise authority over them. But that's not what Jesus is saying he's here to do. He's saying he's not here to be served, he's here to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Earlier in this passage, he says, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" And they said to him, "We are able." And I think this is maybe why this story has hit me so hard, and the triumphal entry has hit me so hard, is I don't think I fully grasped what it means to truly surrender to Jesus. And when I think I even ended yesterday's video saying, I'm ready to serve the Lord, that seems almost as ignorant and ignorant might be the right word, as James and John saying, we are able to drink this cup. We don't even understand the cup that we're being asked to drink. Just like the people don't understand what Jesus riding in on that donkey was actually there to do. We have a tendency to think of things in the worldly sense. And we don't understand that what Jesus is calling us to is suffering and sacrifice. And we might intellectually understand that and then think, oh, but this is actually how it's going to go. But you have to be ready for whatever Jesus is going to call you into. And you might not like it. It might not fit your definition of how you would see your life unfold. And that's why it should be taken seriously when you say that you're here to serve Jesus and serve God, because you have to be ready to drink that cup. And Jesus asks, are you able to drink that cup? And they say, we are able. And his response to that, he says, yeah, you will drink this cup, but you don't understand what that cup is right now. And it's a sobering thought. And I think it's something, so serious right now. But it's something to not take lightly. So then, interesting story, Jesus goes in and cleanses the temple. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. So the idea here is that the temple is supposed to be, well, I'll read the next line. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." So the reason that they're selling doves, I believe it says, or it says pigeons here, and there's money changers is because during this time it's Passover, and I believe 1 million people would go into Jerusalem, and a lot of them would make sacrifices to God. And if you were poor, you maybe couldn't sacrifice, I don't know what it would have been, a lamb or a sheep. So you would sacrifice a dove, or in this case, it says a pigeon. It's different than the R.C. Sproul commentary, which said dove. ESV says pigeon. But if you're poor, you could go in here, you could buy a pigeon, that could be your sacrifice. And it's people from all over, so they do money changes there so that they had the right currency. But it almost sounds like amusement park pricing, or like how much candy costs in the movie theater, where the pigeon in the temple costs 50 times what it would have cost outside the temple. And to exchange your money, you have to pay a 6% fee on that. And then if you don't have perfect change, there's another 6% fee. So it's taking a place that should be a house of prayer, and it's now allowed in a farmer's market of exploitation of the poor. And Jesus does not like that. So he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. So this one still kind of confuses me a bit, because I always want to make the principle that you shouldn't act out of your emotion. You should act out of kind of gentleness and reason, rationality, and just being grounded in God. And we shouldn't ever act out of fear or anger, because that's going to lead to bad results. This clearly makes it seem like Jesus is acting out of anger. He's flipping over tables. I don't think it says it in this one, but in another account, he has a whip, and he's literally driving them out he makes a whip of cords. Now, I asked ChatGPT about this, and it said that in Mark 11:11, it says that he went to the temple the day before and maybe saw this going on, and then he actually comes back the next day and then flips the tables over. So it says, so ChatGPT was saying, oh, he didn't act out of pure anger and impulse. He actually cooled off for a day and then goes in, and this was premeditated. Matthew's account doesn't disprove that. Yeah, it just goes from the triumphal entry down to this one, and where it says, and Jesus entered the temple, doesn't exactly say when that is. So it might be the next day, and it doesn't say if he hadn't already gone to the temple the day before. But I don't know. Reading the story, it seems like he is acting out of anger. But it's a righteous anger in this case, because this is a house of prayer. It's the temple, so it's a place for God. And Jesus is God, so he's protecting his own house. And it's a den of thieves, a den of robbers, as he says. It's turning a holy place into a place of exploitation. And whether he's angry or not, he has the right to be. So just an interesting story there. There's maybe some lessons we could draw about that, about when God is not a place you go to get rich. We'll just leave it at that. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear what these are saying? So he goes from, flipping tables with a whip to healing people, blind and lame. And then children are still crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David. They might understand it actually better than some of the older people do. And Jesus said to them, so the scribes and Pharisees aren't too happy about that because they know what that messianic title means. And they say, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes, have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise? And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there. And I believe this verse that he quotes is from Psalm 8. And he's basically saying that these kids are correct in praising him. So in a way, he's calling himself God. And you know that the scribes and Pharisees would have known exactly what that means. So this shows that Jesus is kind of coming in swinging. He comes in humble on a donkey, but then one of the first things he does is creates a huge scene in the temple, starts healing people. And then when the scribes and Pharisees question him, he kind of says, yeah, I'm God. And so he almost reminds me a little bit, I don't know if I should make this connection, but it almost reminds me a little bit of in Braveheart when Mel Gibson says, I'm going to go pick a fight. That's my bad Scottish accent. But he goes and picks a fight with the English army when the other lords are trying to, get profit from him. He says, no, we're here to do battle. This is going down. And Jesus seems to be saying, yeah, it's time. We're not pulling back anymore. We're not retreating anymore. Let's go. So now it goes, Jesus curses the fig tree. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. So at first, this might seem kind of like a weird story. Jesus goes up to a tree, there's no fruit on it, and he says, you'll never have fruit again. It withers and dies. Kind of interesting. And one of the accounts, it might be Mark, says that the fig tree wasn't in season. But I guess there's some archaeologists or whatever you want to call them who say that fig trees could bloom out of the irregular fig season. And one of the signs that it was blooming was that if it had leaves on it, then you could expect to find figs. So Jesus sees this tree with leaves and he's thinking, oh, this is where I could find fruit. And then he goes there and there is no fruit. So this then becomes an opportunity for him to create a lesson out of something actually in the world. And it seems like God does this in our own lives, where he takes something and we're able to draw a lesson from it. And this is one of those cases that actually is supposed to be pointing towards hypocrisy. It's people who on the surface look like they're Christian, look like they're serving the Lord, but there's no fruit. And those are the people who Jesus says, I don't know you. Now you might think, oh no, is that me? I think that I'm Christian and I make all these mistakes, I sin. It's not saying you have to be perfect, but you should have some fruit. R.C. Sproul was talking about some heresy I'd never heard of called carnal Christians, where people say that you're saved, but you don't see any changes in your actions. But I like the saying, you're saved by faith alone, but not by a faith that is alone. And then I believe it's also in James where he says, faith without works is dead. So it's the faith comes first, but the sign and evidence of true faith is the works that come from that. So this fig tree is like someone who says they're saved, but they're still doing all the same things that they used to do before. And there's no fruit there. So where you might get worried there is, oh, I still do some of the things that I used to do before I became a Christian. Am I actually saved? But it's not that this tree wasn't bearing enough fruit. It wasn't bearing any. So there you can ask yourself, has my life changed since I've become a Christian? Has there been some fruit since I've become a Christian? And I think You could probably honestly answer that question. Then when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" I mean, they've seen him calm a storm, but a fig tree withering surprises them. It almost reminds me of the Israelites, where they just see 10 plagues of God just owning the Egyptians. And then the Egyptians are coming and they say, "We're going to die." How many times does God need to prove himself to us? But we just always forget. And then God just needs to bring us through struggle for us to see his power once again and again and again and again. It's a shame we can't just remember and be faithful. And Jesus answered them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, you will receive if you have faith." This could definitely be one of those verses that's taken out of context and used by the prosperity preachers or whatever they're called, where they say, "Oh, if you just ask God to be rich, it'll happen. If you ask with enough faith for a beautiful wife, you'll get her. If you ask to be a billionaire with a mansion and a private jet, it's going to happen." That's not what Jesus is saying. I think the verse I read today that I really liked was something about God will fulfill the desires of your heart. And on first reading, you might think, that sounds kind of dangerous. And there's some bad desires in my heart. But whatever the first part of that verse was saying was kind of points to the idea that God will transform your desires so that they're in alignment with what God wants for you. And then that might bring us back to what we were talking about earlier, where, what God has planned for us might be very different than what we would have planned for ourselves and what we think that we desire right now. And we might be dragging our feet from where we believe God is leading us, but we just have to trust God. We have to recognize that he knows what's best for us. He's brought us this far. It might be scary, but he will fight for us. All that we need to do is be silent. But it's also understanding what we're getting ourselves into. And that there's really two choices. You're either in or you're out. And I certainly would not want to go back and be out, because I've lived that life and it is filled with turmoil and sinking sand, and you just can't carry that weight on your own. So the alternative is going with God. And if you've made that decision, then don't be like Lot's wife and look back at your old life. Oh, should I still be living that way? Trust God where he's leading you. Know that he'll deliver you. And just try to really understand what it is that he's asking of you. Because it might be hard.